Thank you everyone for coming to Counterculture's third quarter ProDev. Our topic today is on coffee and colonialism. How many of you guys have been to a ProDev before? A couple of you. So especially for the first timers here, welcome. The purpose of ProDev is for us to offer some peer-to-peer education and to give a little bit of insight into specific topics within the coffee industry. These topics change every quarter that we give this talk, and we're super excited to be taking on the topic of coffee and colonialism today. So what are we going to be talking about today? Of course, first and foremost, we want to define just what colonialism is. We're going to explore how colonialism made its way around the globe, particularly in coffee-producing countries. And we're going to use Kenya as a sort of case study to take a look at the colonial governance that once was present in this country and see how Kenya has formed into an independent nation and what coffee production has looked like throughout this process. We'll also talk about some of the lasting ramifications of colonialism. While technically we're in a post-colonial era, we still see tons of effects from these systems. And we'll explore that as well as how to move forward. Now, the purpose of this ProDev particularly is to open a greater conversation. So much time, effort, and research is dedicated towards understanding the effects of colonialism throughout the globe. And we don't expect to leave this room knowing all of the answers about how to move forward, but we do hope that we can inspire a greater conversation, not just amongst ourselves, but throughout the coffee industry itself. All right, so let's dive on in here. Again, in order to understand colonialism, the first thing we need to do is to define it. So we can understand colonialism as the policy or practice of either fully or partially taking control over land in order to colonize it, whether that be with settlers or in order to exploit the resources of this place, to economically exploit this country. Now, of course, in terms of our topic today, we're going to be looking at coffee as this resource that has been exploited over years. It's also important to understand that colonialism does have an effect that transcends economics, right? Colonialism does not just end in these very cut and dry sort of big picture systems, but it also imparts certain things like language or arts or religion and sort of forces a dominant culture upon a place and often displaces, if not eradicates, those elements of culture that are already part of that area. So in order to really engage with this conversation, we need to take a look at colonialism spread throughout the globe. And the way we're going to do that is by moving century by century through how coffee-producing countries were affected by colonial powers. To understand the spread of this, where we need to start is pre-colonialism in the 1400s. In the 1400s, Europe is at the twilight of the Middle Ages. The agrarian-based feudalist economies are starting to fall away in favor of trade-driven mercantilism, right? These societies are no longer purely concerned with sustenance, right? There's a greater interest in the trade of goods and resources. And not just the trade, but the obtainment of some of these. So we can sort of define the start of colonialism by two main events. In 1488, a Portuguese explorer rounds the tip of Africa by sea, which opens up a naval passage from Europe to Asia. this is obviously huge in terms of the trade routes that it offers to European countries, right? And as we are probably all familiar with, in 1492, sailing under the Spanish crown, Christopher Columbus tries to find a new passage to India by sailing westward across the Atlantic. And in this transatlantic passage, he stumbles upon islands that are within the contemporary borders of the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti. When Columbus returns to Europe after that first expedition in 1493, this really rocks the European trading world, right? All of a sudden, there is all of this new uncharted land that they have no idea what it holds. The two main trading powers at this time, Spain and Portugal, are concerned about how this land will be divided up. And in 1494, Pope Alexander VI brokers the Treaty of Tordesillas. And what this treaty does is it divides the, and I quote, non-Christian world by a point of reference in the Atlantic Ocean just off the western tip of Africa at the Cape Verde Islands. The 1494 decree says that any land to the east can be claimed by the Portuguese, while any land to the west can be claimed by the Spanish. And this sets the stage for what colonialism looks like between 1500 and 1600. Now, in 1506, the Treaty of Tordesillas is adjusted. And that line that once ended at the Cape Verde Islands, right off the western coast of Africa, is moved 370 leagues, a little over 1,000 miles to the west. And this allows the Portuguese to claim land in contemporary Brazil. However, the Portuguese also take a pretty broad interest in what the world has to offer. They continue to really aggressively trade throughout India and Oceania, while also continuing to do lots of naval explorations rather than founding colonies. Spain, on the other hand, in the beginning of the 1500s, really aggressively sets out on a campaign to take the Americas. And as we see here, the Spanish claim lots of land. They claim land everywhere from the southern tip of South America up into the contemporary United States. Throughout this land, we have claims in what are now 17 coffee-producing countries. So the Spanish crown really dominates during this century. You'll also see that in this time, the Spanish also claim the Philippines. Now, between 1600 and 1700, claims start to become a little more complicated here, particularly on the eastern side of the globe. The new player that we see in the 17th century is the Dutch Republic. Confederated in 1581, the Dutch stake land claims on many islands in contemporary Indonesia, as well as the island of East Timor. We also see during this century that Portugal claims the first European land stake in Africa, taking land in Angola. In addition, between 1600 and 1700, you see the Spanish sort of fill in the gaps of their American empire, taking more land in between its northern and southern borders in Latin America. In 1700 to 1800, during this time frame, we see colonialism in full effect in the Americas. In coffee-producing countries, Brazil and Spain, or Portugal rather, in Brazil and Spain, sort of take deep root in their colonies, right? They're simply dedicated towards maintaining their colonial power. However, Britain also becomes a little more of a global player during this century. Of course, we know Great Britain has massive land claims outside of the coffee-producing area in North America, but we also see British colonization spread throughout the globe, particularly in Yemen and India, as far as coffee-producing nations are concerned. Towards the end of the 18th century, we see the foundation of colonialism rocked a little bit in the Americas by the American Revolution, as well as a struggle for independence in Haiti that emerges. And that sets the stage for the 19th century wave of independence that happens across the Americas. In the early 1800s, you see many South American countries declare independence from the Spanish crown. You also see the same movement happening up into Central America. Towards the end of that century, we also have Brazil declare independence from the Portuguese. Now, as the Americas are claiming independence, we see the shift of colonialism move towards the eastern side of the globe, right? So in the 1800s is really when African colonialism just takes off at a rapid rate. In 1885, we see Great Britain and Germany carve up large swaths of Africa and make territorial claims there. We also have Belgium claiming the Congo in the 1800s. France in the 19th century makes claims all across the African continent, as well as on the island of Madagascar and in several nations in Southeast Asia as well. By the 1900s, we see independence pretty well spread throughout the Americas. However, the Eastern Hemisphere, once again, is a different story. The structure of global power gets rattled a little bit by World War I. And at the end of World War I, Germany is ordered by League of Nations mandate to relinquish any of its colonies in Africa. And most of that land gets divided up between Great Britain and France, causing a pretty hefty consolidation of colonial power throughout the African continent. With this consolidation of colonial power, what we see is a pretty drastic economic restructuring take place across the African continent. Systems of agriculture are really radically changed, and the sort of whole payment structure of societies gets a hefty shift during this period of time. However, this colonial consolidation also leads to a lot of allegiances that are drawn between African countries and European powers, who will then go on to fight in World War II. World War II winds up enlisting a decent amount of soldiers from Africa. And when the war is over, as the United Nations looks to reshape the world order, there's certainly a nod to the idea of independence for many African nations. In addition, you have a lot of democratic populist movements that arise after World War I and just really accelerate very rapidly after World War II. That set the stage for our contemporary world map. So today, we technically live in a post-colonial society. By the 1960s, you see a pretty massive independence movement throughout Africa, and lots of independence movements elsewhere in Oceania. India declares independence in the 1940s as well. So today we are in what we consider post-colonial society, right? The European political powers do not control these large swaths of the globe, politically speaking. However, there is still a lot of influence from these outside countries in a lot of the former colonized world. And this comes through cultural imperialism as well as private interests. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we move on from here. So let's zoom in. Obviously, the entire world the entire coffee producing world is a pretty large amount of land to talk about. So what we want to do is use Kenya as a case study for the effects of colonialism, not just on the nation, but on coffee production as well. Although European missionaries made their way into the borders of Kenya during the 1840s, it's not until 1885 at an event called the Berlin Conference that we see the land of Kenya claimed by European powers. During this 1885 conference, Great Britain draws up what's called the East African Protectorate, which claims a large portion of contemporary Kenya, as well as land that comprises Uganda and parts of Somalia. After this claim is made, we see a pretty large movement of British citizens into Kenya. This man named Lord Delamere, in the early part of the 20th century, recognizes the Kenyan highlands as a place that's really rich in its agricultural potential and encourages British colonization in this area. However, in the course of colonizing this area, many native peoples are displaced. As we mentioned, World War I sort of shakes up what the African continent looks like, politically speaking. And in 1920, Great Britain redraws the way it considers Kenya. Some parts of Kenya are officially declared a colony, while others remain under this protectorate structure. But that being said, the entire country is still under British administrative rule at this time. However, in this same year, you see independence and equality movements begin to emerge in this country. A man named Harry Thuku is responsible for forming the Young Kikuyu Association, and James Botha, as well as Joseph Kangethe, are two key figures who form the Kikuyu Central Association. These groups are responsible for pushing for the equality of Kenyan natives in the governance of the nation. And 43 years after this, in 1963, Kenya holds its first democratic election. It officially becomes an independent nation on December 12th of 1963, when Jomo Kenyatta is elected as the country's prime minister. Now, during the British colonial rule, you do see a pretty hefty investment on the part of the British government in agriculture in Kenya. And in 1922, an organization is founded called Scott Agricultural Laboratories. During the 1930s, Scott Labs, as we will commonly refer to it, shifts a lot of its energy towards the coffee crop. And in 1934, Scott Labs dedicates 27 acres of their research farms purely to the development of coffee. Now, although Kenya, in our contemporary time, is free from British governance, we do still see a lot of these lasting ramifications of colonialism affecting coffee farmers. For this ProDev, we interviewed Peter Mbature, who owns a farm called Kamavindi in Kenya. Peter is not only the manager of Kamavindi, but he also works as a consultant for counterculture in Kenya, helping to provide farmers in the area with tips on how to best cultivate their crops and how to get appropriate pricing for their coffees as well. So talking to Peter was pretty illuminating as far as how a lot of these systems from colonialism still kind of affect what coffee farmers deal with on a day-to-day basis. Kenya has a very interesting coffee purchasing structure where coffee farmers and producers sell their coffee to people called marketers. Marketers take that coffee to auction where it is sold to special buyers. Now, those marketers, for the large part, all belong to a very small group of corporations. And these corporations are sort of in control of many aspects of coffee farming in Kenya. Many of these corporations will own everything from pesticides to fertilizers that they are in turn selling back to the coffee farmers. These farmers who are receiving payments for their coffee that are determined by this same company who sells them the product, right? Peter says he's experienced this firsthand and has been privy to many farmers experiencing this exact same struggle of having one or a small handful of coffee companies control the market in this nation. So what we want to do now is take time for a little tasting exercise where we talk about two Kenyan coffees that provide some relevance to colonial governance as well as Kenya as an independent country. And the first one we're going to start out with is a coffee called SL28. SL28 is a coffee that was selected by Scott Labs, hence the SL, in the 1930s. Between 1935 and 1939, Scott Labs spent a lot of time selecting individual coffee varieties that would thrive in Kenyan climates. And SL28 happens to be one of the most popular amongst those selected varieties today. The reason that this coffee was selected was partially for its yield, partially for its drought resistance. However, one huge issue that we see with SL28 today is the fact that it is not very resistant to many blights in coffee, most particularly one called coffee berry disease. In 1968, Kenya experienced a massive epidemic of coffee berry disease. And this epidemic is actually responsible for the creation of the Ruiru 11 variety. This variety was developed by research from the Kenyan government. And the purpose of the development of Ruiru 11 was to find a crop that not only maintained an excellent cup quality, but showed resistance to CBD and a high yield as well. This is sort of a variety made with Kenyan coffee producers in mind. So the actual breeding of Ruiru 11 was a very complicated process that involved some very elaborate selection of varieties in order to breed a male parent and a female parent that would then create Ruiru 11. The male parent is a tall, bushy plant that was selected mainly for CBD-resistant qualities. We also see some concern for cup quality with this, but primarily what was selected was purely for its disease resistance. So we saw varieties like K7, which is another Kenyan coffee variety, as well as an East Timor hybrid and a coffee called Rume Sudan, which were all bred in order to come up with the male parent. The female parent was bred in order to specifically increase cup quality as well as to improve yield. The female parent had large amounts of Catimor used in its development, Catimor being a hybrid itself between two varieties, one Timor and one called Katura. Katura belongs to a greater family shared by varieties like SL28, all from a Bourbon descendants. So what we'll do now is we'll just take a moment to pass around some cups of these coffees so you guys can taste the difference between SL28, this variety made by Scott Labs, and Ruiru 11 as well. There you go, indeed. So now that we've talked a little bit about the way certain companies can control the coffee market, let's take a look at the global coffee market itself. The graphic on the screen here is one provided in a study called the Coffee Barometer, which was published in 2016. And it was a pretty comprehensive report on the market consolidation that we see in the coffee world today. As of that report 2 years ago, approximately 40% of the world's coffee market was passing through these two companies, JAB and Nestle. What we see with massive amounts of market consolidation like this is that only a small handful of companies truly determine the price for coffee throughout the globe. And there's a pretty obvious inequity that we can see through this. Globally, the coffee market is worth about $200 billion today. However, we only see less than 10% of that wealth staying within coffee-producing countries. Beyond that, coffee producers themselves often see an average of 2% of the retail price of the coffee actually paid to them. So the inequity throughout this system is pretty drastic, right? Again, if you only have a small handful of companies determining how much is paid for coffee, then these companies will control what our market looks like. So all of this to say, where do we go from here? How do we take our understanding of colonialism and its lasting effects on the coffee industry and actually spin this into a productive conversation? The first easiest thing that we can do is just to educate ourselves, to research more, to learn more about the coffees that we're involved with, and to push ourselves to do better than the status quo in the coffee producing or in the coffee purchasing realm. More importantly, it's also up to us to listen to what coffee producers have to say. This is not a conversation that we can have without the input of people further down the supply chain, right? And ultimately, we need to familiarize ourselves with each individual supply chain. It's incredibly difficult for us to take one large, sweeping generalization of what coffee production looks like, because in every instance, it's different. We need to engage with the coffee supply chain at every step of the way so that we can develop our better understanding of it. At this point, let's just go ahead and have a discussion. Let's just open it up to a greater conversation about coffee and colonialism. Anybody who has any questions, feel free to ask those. Anybody who has any comments, any takeaways or insights, feel free to share those.
Just curious if there's been, or if you've noticed any kind of correlation with countries that were colonizing countries and the amount that they invested in agricultural development while they were colonizing the countries, with now their coffee culture or their investment in agricultural development. Like, are they still investing, like Britain with Kenya?
Sure.
Still investing a lot, and do you notice that there are certain countries that are investing more?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We didn't do any corollary studies to see what money was coming into some of these countries. I think it is interesting just to look at this sort of big picture shift from political to privatized power, right? Like, government powers aren't necessarily what mandate the world order anymore. Increasingly, the fate of the world is left into the hands of these really large companies that we are referencing here, and definitely like their interests. You may have like a British company itself who just happens to see all of the perfect pieces that were put down by a British colony, and they're able to just kind of go back in with some familiarity. I'm definitely spitballing a little bit here, but it's certainly valid. And I think that it is interesting, like going off of that topic too, seeing how some of these coffee producing countries are today shifting away from coffee, because like in Kenya, for example, like coffee production very much is a holdover from the colonial society, right? But at the end of the day, Kenyan coffee farmers are not getting paid the amount of money that they need. Most Kenyan coffee farmers are seeing average prices of about 55 cents per kilogram for their coffee. And we see a lot of Kenyan coffee farmers shifting away from that and seeking out other products. For example, macadamia nuts are a huge growing product in Kenya, because farmers can receive $1.80 per kilogram for that same product.
Does that have anything to do also with the coffee industry? Is that connected at all with the big macadamia milk surge, or is that disconnected?
I don't know. I like that theory. Macadamia milk coming up next. Yeah, I mean, I definitely can't say there's any like hardline correlation there, but would be interesting to, an interesting theory to tease out for sure.
In relation to what Peter was saying in that last slide about if 70% of Kenyan producers had a market like Comavindi did, along with like a similar model that they have, they would be just as like profitable. And is that in relation to like the specialty realm, or is that looking more at like coffee as a whole, and if Job and Nestle also pay into the model of transparency and negotiation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge thing. The way that our price structure is set up with Comavindi, as well as with all of the farmers in Kushkamana, is what we call farm gate pricing. So like when we purchase coffee from Peter, we're directly negotiating prices with him. We actually know how much the farmer is getting paid in this instance. And beyond that, we're trying to make sure that our pay actually stacks up to the amount of work that Peter is doing himself, right? Like he does processing on site. Now, if that was not a part of his cost, that might change the way we pay for that coffee, right? But because he does have this really comprehensive operation and continues to be just a really amazing coffee producer, we're able to very directly say like, these are your costs of goods. This is the price for your quality. And we can pretty directly say like, this is what we see as a fair payment here. And additionally, we're not controlling the rest of his operation in this instance, right? So the kind of like classic Kenyan auction structure, where you are seeing large amounts of the coffee bought up by this small handful of companies, it just makes it difficult for coffee farmers to really feel like they are able to negotiate their prices. Anybody who's kept up with the global commodity price of coffee, the C market price, has seen that in the last month, like this price has just been tanking. And to these large companies, that looks good. They're like, great, I can buy coffee for 97 cents a pound, fantastic. But we all know that that's not enough for coffee farmers to actually generate income in most instances. It does take some degree of wanting to pay more, wanting to actually invest back into these areas to change that. Yeah.
Where does the burden fall now for research and development? Is Nestle and all these other companies, are they, whenever there's new diseases developing or ones that are taking over, are they doing
Yeah.
Where the brunt of responsibility is lying?
I mean, it is, I think that's such a great question. Like, where does the responsibility fall at the end of the day when we see all of these challenges coming up against coffee production? And unfortunately, like, we don't, there may be some in-house, there may be some in-house like R&D divisions for some of these large countries, but as far as the kind of global conversation about how do we save coffee, like, these players are not necessarily, they're not at the forefront, right? We definitely see the specialty coffee industry leading the way in pushing research and development in coffee. And, that's not always small companies. Like, you do have companies like Starbucks who do actually put tons of resources into trying to, discover how coffee can be more sustainable. And of course, counterculture does take we take a pretty large step to try and invest in some of this research and development. Really, I mean, it is a very odd pre-competitive mixture that we see right now of just the companies who want to actually do something. But unfortunately, it's like, how can you say that that's enough, right? When you don't really have any way to ensure, when you don't have a way to ensure that everyone's sort of playing their part in this global system, it definitely gets complicated.
You see examples of like Nestle acquiring Blue Bottle and Coca-Cola acquiring Costco in the European market as a move in the positive direction, because like Nestle, who by and large, for the most part, is buying the C market, maybe not to like demonize Nestle, but buying C market price, acquiring Blue Bottle, who by and large is maybe paying $4, $5, $6 a pound for direct trade coffee. Do you think Nestle will move in that direction at all through acquiring things like that, or are companies like that eventually going to just kind of pull the specialty market more towards the C market price? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a big question. It is.
Like for Amazon, for example, acquiring Whole Foods, you don't see Amazon paying the farmers or where they're getting their food from, where you're seeing them get more and better discounts to the consumers.
Right, absolutely. But farm prices are not really shifting. I think that's pretty largely indicative. And it is worth mentioning that like Nestle and JAB companies of this caliber, they do encapsulate so many smaller divisions, like Blue Bottle with Nestle, for example. And Blue Bottle's largely been left to do business as usual, right? Not a lot has changed with that division. But that being said, that does account for such a small niche within the greater Nestle conglomeration. It's sort of tough to say whether that's going to have any impact on coffee purchasing for the conglomerate as a whole, right? Blue Bottle may be left to do its own thing because it is specialty and it is niche, but whether it really has any reflection back on the rest of the company's purchasing practices, I tend to doubt it. And at the end of the day, I do think that when you do see market consolidation like this, I think it is often going to boil down to exactly what you're talking about, where it's the farmers aren't necessarily going to get more money, but the purchasing power of this large conglomeration really allows for them to lower their costs or lower their sales prices, lower their retail cost across the board. And then it further gets complicated because it's if Blue Bottle then becomes the cheapest retail specialty coffee as a representative of Nestle, how does that compete with other independent coffee companies who are actually, actually trying to do something in terms of the supply chain, like actually trying to change things? Will that like detract from investment in those companies? Again, there's like no clean answer to it, and it's really tough to see, it's tough to see like from within, but it's a really awesome question. Yeah.
Now in Kenya, how hard is it for you guys to get access to the fund?
Difficult, I would say. Yeah. The work that we've been able to do with Peter to like directly source coffee has been, it's been difficult to like get to the stage of this relationship that that we're at right now. And I think we're very happy with how we have everything set up currently. But the sort of strictures put in place by the government in terms of like what those auctions look like these auctions aren't just something where people are like, oh, well, that just seems like the easiest way to sell my coffee, right? These auctions are actually government regulated ways of making sure that coffee is being exported from the country. And it's just one of those funny tie-ups of like corporate interest with the actual government in this area, where inevitably, I think at the end of the day, there is a pretty altruistic approach to the Kenyan coffee auction. Like, it is intended to get Kenyan coffee in the hands of coffee buyers. But that being said, when you have these really large, like, exploitative companies who just see like how they can come in and kind of like run that market, it gets a little more gray. We flashed these up here. These are a couple of posters. We've got these posters up in our window, but they're from our transparency report release. I encourage you all to check out our transparency report, but we definitely didn't want to make this conversation about counterculture as much as like talking about the coffee industry at large here. But the transparency report is an example of how we try to do better and try to be a different company, and ultimately also reflects like, even when we're not able to source coffee, like in our perfect conditions, it still shows like just how we're breaking it down. And I think it's just counterculturecoffee.com/transparency-report. Thank you all. Really, yeah, drink more coffee.